For decades, the phrase "mark of the beast" has triggered images of microchips, barcodes, biometric scans, and dystopian governments. But when you slow down and read Revelation carefully, something far more layered begins. The Apostle John wrote Revelation in a world dominated by Rome. Emperor worship was not symbolic but political. Allegiance to Caesar was woven into economic participation and civic identity in ways modern readers overlook. When Revelation speaks of a mark on the hand or forehead, it is not introducing a random sci-fi detail. It is using imagery deeply rooted in Jewish scripture and first-century cultural symbolism. Today, in the Hebrew Bible, the hand represented action, the forehead represented belief. Faithful Israelites were described metaphorically as having God's law on their hands and foreheads, meaning their actions aligned with divine instruction. John mirrors that imagery, but contrasts it with allegiance to the beast. Scholars interpret this symbol as imperial power demanding ultimate loyalty. That historical layer changes the tone from futuristic panic to spiritual warning. The original audience heard a warning about compromise and aligning social participation with systems demanding spiritual surrender. The mark becomes less about hardware and more about allegiance, yet modern tension returns in digital. Today's world operates through digital systems, biometric verification, and centralized databases. They regulate access in ways that feel structurally closer to Revelation's economic warning than any previous generation has ever experienced in history. Revelation describes restricted buying and selling for those aligned with particular authority. For centuries, this seemed logistically impossible on a global scale. However, that impossibility no longer exists in our modern technological era. Digital currency frameworks and programmable money are technically capable of restricting participation. Earlier civilizations simply could not implement this. That does not automatically fulfill prophecy, but it does create a very specific condition. Conditions awaken conversation. Is technology the mark? No, but technology could become a tool within a broader system of enforced allegiance. Revelation describes this in symbolic, yet economically concrete terms for the faithful reader. Revelation never describes the mark as a random implant detached from ideology. It is always tied to worship and loyalty. It is a declaration of authority that challenges ultimate devotion to the divine creator. This nuance matters deeply. Fear-driven interpretations skip context and jump to speculation. Serious study requires patience, historical grounding, and linguistic awareness. The Greek word translated as mark is charagma, used for imperial seals. In the Roman world, coins carried the emperor's image. This signified allegiance through everyday economic exchange. When Jesus was asked about taxes, he referenced Caesar's image on a coin, highlighting intertwined political authority. John's audience understood that economic systems were never neutral. They were connected to declarations of loyalty and civic identity shaped by imperial pressure. Projecting microchips without understanding Rome risks missing the original tension entirely. Ignoring modern technological convergence would be equally naive. For the first time, economic access is mediated digitally and identity verified biometrically. Transactions are tracked globally in real time, creating entirely new and powerful possibilities. Possibility is not proof, but it shifts interpretation from fantasy to realism. The mark is a dividing line between those aligned with systems opposed to God and those who refuse compliance despite consequence. It is about conviction under pressure and worship under constraint. It asks whether allegiance can be purchased through economic exclusion. These themes are timeless, applying under Rome and various regimes throughout human history. They resonate today when institutions attempt to blur the boundary between civic participation and spiritual compromise. Assuming the mark must look dramatic or mechanical is a mistake. Revelation's power lies in its subtle nature. Compliance feels practical and reasonable until the cost of refusal becomes visible. The question is not what device exists, but what system requires visible allegiance to access life. Modern believers are now paying attention. Digital infrastructure makes economic conditionality conceivable at scale. Early Christians faced a similar dilemma. offer incense to Caesar, or risk exclusion. The mark was not primarily technological. It was ideological, expressed through structure. When Revelation warns about buying and selling restrictions, it describes economic leverage used to enforce loyalty. This pattern has appeared repeatedly through sanctions and financial exclusion. These are tools of power, not futuristic inventions. The difference today is scale and speed. Global networks allow enforcement to happen instantly and universally. This acceleration makes people ask new questions. When asked responsibly, these questions are prudent rather than being dangerous. Responsible study stands between hysteria and denial. It examines the text, history, and technology without forcing conclusions prematurely. Revelation's purpose was not to create paranoia. It was to encourage endurance under economic threat. If the mark is about allegiance expressed through structure, the real battlefield is conviction and identity. It is the line where convenience begins to challenge conscience in subtle and almost imperceptible ways for everyone. History shows powerful systems begin with efficiency and order. They promise safety, stability, and streamlined participation. This makes resistance seem irrational. Pressure evolves gradually as layers of dependency increase within daily survival and society. Revelation describes a moment when refusal carries tangible consequence. Losing buying and selling rights is not symbolic. It represents exclusion from economic survival. Critics once dismissed this scenario as implausible on a global level. How could a global system regulate commerce so uniformly without modern technology? That question no longer feels theoretical. Digital currencies are programmable and transactions monitored in real time. Access can be revoked instantly now. Technology itself is not prophecy, but it demonstrates capacity. Capacity changes the conversation from impossible to conceivable. Responsible interpretation requires careful reflection rather than emotional reaction to the rapid changes we see today. Those who refuse the mark are described as patient and faithful. They are not panicked conspiracy theorists. They are steady and grounded in their allegiance despite loss. This portrait suggests the test is maturity. It is about recognizing when loyalty demands compromise of devotion. This line may emerge through policies framed as necessary for security or stability. Populations are conditioned to equate compliance with being a responsible citizen. In every era, believers faced moments where civic expectation clashed with conviction. Rome demanded incense. Totalitarian regimes demanded pledges. Modern societies demand silence. The mechanism changes, but the spiritual pattern remains the same. Revelation's imagery amplifies significance to show spiritual stakes behind ordinary transactions. The mark is described as visible, an outward sign of inward allegiance. In biblical symbolism, visibility signals public identification and communicates your loyalty. Those who refuse the mark are sealed by God. This is not a chip, but spiritual ownership that transcends economic pressure. 2 allegiances, 2 seals, and 2 visible declarations reinforce that worship is central. Worship is ultimate loyalty, trust, and submission. Fixating exclusively on microchips oversimplifies a theological warning about power and devotion. Dismissing technological convergence would be careless, as infrastructure shapes our behavior and every decision. When access becomes conditional, conscience is tested. This is the enduring relevance of the warning. We can identify the pattern of coercive allegiance emerging throughout history. Early Christians were called to remain faithful. This calling does not require predicting times. It requires cultivating discernment and courage long before any system materializes. The mark conversation should produce preparation and strengthen conviction rather than producing any kind of fear. Deepen your understanding of Scripture instead of obsessing over technology. If allegiance is tested structurally, only rooted identity will withstand it. The future will not surprise those anchored in principle rather than in panic. Revelation calls for steady awareness, not hysteria. Systems evolve and loyalties are quietly negotiated through everyday participation. The question is whether we will recognize the line and remain faithful when convenience becomes conditional. This is the tension Revelation leaves us with today. It is not a device, but a decision. We must decide where our ultimate loyalty lies before the pressure of the world demands our compromise.